especially like if you work at a university and you do like diversity work, you hit the trap point where you're like, I can explain to these people whatever these things they think want to mean all day, and we are still fucked next week when we go to this meeting. Like, it's just not sinking in.
No comment, but.
Philosophy. I'm Lillian. Here with me today is Gil, Owen, and Will. Hey guys.
Hello.
Hey.
Yo.
And for today's episode, we're very excited to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Michael Thomas. Hey Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Yo, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
So Michael is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, working in aesthetics, pragmatism, and their intersection with philosophy of race. For this episode, we read Sensibility in Section 8, Kendrick Lamar's Poetics of Problems, which we'll put into the show notes. So if the name Kendrick Lamar doesn't already suggest to you that we're going to do an episode on hip-hop and Black aesthetics, that is what we're up to, and this is going to be the second installment of our What is Aesthetics series. So by way of introduction, I'll keep it short so I can turn it over to Michael. I'll ask one general question about Black aesthetics, and then propose a couple of concepts from what we read that could help us think about hip-hop's relationship to it. And then Michael, I'll just ask you to, add things, what stands out to you. I'll ask you the same general question, and then we can get going in our discussion. So the first question is just, what is Black aesthetics? And according to Paul Taylor, it happens when artists take seriously Black experience and the value of the lives of people racialized as Black. And I quote, "Black lives have to matter for an engagement to count as Black aesthetics. If they do not, then it does not." This definition is more capacious than I anticipated, actually, but I like it for that reason, since it makes a conceptual connection to the way that Michael later defines the distinctive aesthetic quality of hip-hop, which is as a problem space. It's a working out of unresolved intergenerational trauma, a disruption in what is supposed to make sense based on coherent political and cultural tropes. Michael argues that it's reductive to interpret rap or hip-hop as solely carrying a political message, since everything Black people do is supposed to pack an easily digestible social message. But what it does is actually the opposite. It's messy, since there is no single voice that it seeks to represent. In this sense, hip-hop is anti-essentialist in its nature, which is what makes it ironically universal in that very nature. The characters that speak through hip-hop don't try to resolve contradictions for you. They let you sit with them, hate the parts that are painful, feel rage, then give you permission to love the things that might seem ugly but are not, while allowing you to hope, project, and cope with a reality that resists the self-confidence and personal integrity that those emotions require. My favorites all have alter egos, for instance, from Nicki Minaj, who I forced the guys to listen to on 3 separate tracks. We all made a playlist together, to Eminem, who is the first point of entry that I had for hip-hop. I think, like a lot of Midwestern white kids, they both have alter egos, and I get to fight with those egos, rock with them, see the diversity in the unresolved parts of myself. And in that process, what emerges from the chaos is calm, even if it lasts for only 3 minutes before I have to move on, and to the next 25 years of my life after I first encountered this genre as a young kid. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael and ask, what are the general features of Black aesthetics, the kinds of things that you tend to use to demarcate what it is that you are interested in and talk about? And then how do you think about hip-hop's relationship to that? Maybe you can fill in the details of some of what you wrote in your article, or just other thoughts you've had since then.
Yeah, word. So I think the way to answer that, the easiest is to say, the reason why that Taylor piece is so important for me and why Black is Beautiful is so important for me is because he ends up defining Black aesthetics not in terms of a particular theme or particular topic. He has a few that he'll use, but it's primarily as a community discursive practice, like where we're arguing over, criticizing, creating work to try to define sort of what's going on at the intersection of aesthetic experience and our social experience, right? So when I'm doing this kind of work between stuff in philosophy of race, work in pragmatism, and work in process philosophy, I'm thinking about social aesthetics, right? Which is the way in which how we move through the world, how our societies are structured, I think for me are more importantly structured by bonds of aesthetic feeling. And we can talk about what that means as we move through a lot of the music, right? So it became important for me to also think about that as an entry into Black aesthetics, as somebody who, I say it this way, has a reluctant relationship, especially to hip hop, because I grew up loving hip hop. I grew up listening to a lot of it, but I wasn't allowed to listen to it as a young kid until around high school, college was when I leave and I really start saying so I got to see Biggie videos, but never listened to Ready to Die. So now I have to listen to Ready to Die and figure out what's going on, right? And this entire new world of music opens up to you that you haven't had access to. Because, and we can talk about this later too, I grew up in the 90s and we're in the middle of this conflict between sort of post-Cosby respectability, and there are certain things that I, as a young Black man, am not supposed to do. And this music is going to lead me in those directions, right? So it becomes an important way for me, and this will slide into, I think, the anecdote that you told about your entry to hip-hop, to sort of interrogate my own relationship to rap music and what that means, right? Because also that's a time where hip-hop is becoming mainstream, and the primary way of dealing with it is actually just through consumption of culture. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about later about sort of what happens when it goes regional. So we're trying to experience or understand different spaces through music, or also just trying to kind of wrestle with the problematic aspects of what we listen to. So I think where my interest starts is kind of thinking about what are we doing when we listen to and talk about the music. So on the one hand, I'm interested in how this can maybe create and move us into certain spaces, how it creates certain forms of sensibility, which comes up in Lissa's article on hip-hop, and also what we can do to use hip-hop for identity formation or thinking about how societies function, right? Because half of this is sort of, I end up using hip-hop in a lot of ways as a space for personal exploration. And we can talk about that when we get to the playlist. Moon and Stars is there as kind of a sort of microcosm of different things I've been thinking about, especially recently. In my relationship to a lot of problematic shit I used to listen to when I was younger, but I think actually moved me in really good directions.
Yeah, I really like that. And I have to say, there was something very strange you were describing about how you weren't allowed to listen to hip hop growing up, because I guess I hadn't realized that was also my experience. My parents, and let me be very clear, love my parents. They did the best that they could. They very much were on the idea that the music that you listen to isn't only about enjoyment, is also about a set of values you are creating in dialogue with this artist. And so they got me, and I'm not really embarrassed about this, but my first album that I ever owned was The Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I think my parents are kind of...
Mine was the Monkees.
Oh, shit, okay, all right, so
wow.
Yeah, I'm not the only one.
The greatest hits of the Monkees.
I think my parents are kind of surprised by it, but they were like, but those are still good, clean values, though. Would we prefer that, it was Luther Vandross or Aretha Franklin? Sure, but at least, the joke I made before we got it is keeping you off the streets. But, I really only started listening to hip-hop, honestly, is because my friends in college were like, you need to listen to this beat. And I realized, and this is something I'd like to ask you, because so much of what you're focusing on, Paul Taylor, this notion of assembling Black aesthetics, but learning how to listen to it, is I didn't even know how to listen to hip hop. All of it, I'm really ashamed to admit this, I'm not very good at listening to lyrics. I go beat first, harmony, does it feel good? And I'm like, I have no idea what these people are saying. And I realized I had no idea how to parse this, how to engage with it, what was going on. And so maybe you could say a little bit about the practice of listening to hip hop. Is it a particular type of responsive practice, or is it just immediately you get it?
So that's one of the reasons I think I used Lissa's reading for one of this too, is she kind of hit me I hadn't been paying attention to the amount of aesthetic attention it requires to actually unpack what's going on in a hip-hop song, right? And I think the Kendrick piece is a good example of me actually figuring out what that looks like structurally. Because like I was telling y'all before, so this was an edited volume. They picked all the albums from Section 80 to Damn, and they asked some people to write chapters and then gave us the album. I wanted To Pimp a Butterfly because I listened to Pimp a Butterfly back and forth. And I knew why this was important to me. I could pick out all the pieces. And I got to Section 80 and I was like, this is the album where there was some tracks on this I like, but like I've never really jived with this. I like listened to it a couple times in Chicago downtown and was like, I'll go back to Good Kid, Mad City. Like I'm good. So the process of like writing that paper was, I was like, so I have to figure out what the hell's going on with this album. Let's just start listening. And what I realized that I had missed was, in all those other albums, it's easy to talk about how Kendrick's music is cinematic because it's, at that point, he's kind of perfected the form, right? He understands how to use skits, how to sequence the songs, how to add ad-libs to kind of move things through, right? And I think To Pimp a Butterfly is so complicated, you know that you're supposed to be listening that heavy. Section 80, since it's so early, it feels like a bunch of tracks. So it took like 3 or 4 listens of like, so what's happening in the characters? And I realized I wasn't paying close enough attention to the language. So there's that long piece right in the middle where I'm really obsessed with his use of you, for how it flips things inside and outside of the narrative. And that was one of those moments to say, so this is actually where he's sort of perfecting that form. And it took multiple listens and kind of, I think, working through those levels. So that process you're describing, I think, is what most people have to do to get into it, right? And it's what makes hip hop so powerful, is you've got beats and hooks and you sort of lock in, right? It kind of traps you, you go. And then eventually, if you can stop thinking about it and just listen to what's happening, the flows will catch you and it becomes easier to listen. So it's also a practice of listening, right? And I think that's, if we can go back to Lissa to kind of conclude, right? That's what makes that so important, is you actually learn that listening is an active practice and you can hear people without ever actually understanding what they say, right? So that's the one piece. Yeah. And we can talk further, but I think then the level after that is, and this is where I think I'm working now with rebuilding my own knowledge with a lot of people, is also all the directions that language pushes you once you encounter. Because there's mad references that you're not getting into unless you're from these places, know these people, remember this time, and that actually leads you out from the music into the world, and I think helps me and you respond to like the concerns that our parents would have about this, which is like, if you sat down and talked to us about this music and where it's going and where this is coming from, we have a very different conversation about why these people feel this way, right? But instead, you just want me to not feel and act like these folks, and that's, I understand, like, I get it.
Sure.
There's something else that happens through that aesthetic engagement.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, so I wanted to ask about this distinction that you draw in that Lamar piece between something that would be closer to like conscious hip hop, where it's commenting, it's doing a social commentary, like it's commenting on society. And then you distinguish that from another way of understanding like what is so like rich in rap music is that it's more a kind of complex aesthetic reflection of like social problems, not necessarily a comment on them. And yeah, so I was wondering if you could kind of say a little bit more about that distinction, because I agree with that distinction, by the way. I think that's what makes it such a potent art form, is all of that complexity in the way that it reflects a set of circumstances, a person, a story, a community, whatever, instead, rather than just saying like, this is bad, this is good, you know, whatever. Yeah, so.
And that's like, I have a kind of, I think one way to say this is I have a kind of anti-epistemic bias sometimes, which is what pushes me towards aesthetics. And the other, and it comes up in, I think, a lot of aesthetic philosophy in some important ways, right? So that distinction I'm making right on the basis of those two different interpretations of things that Lamar does on the political level, right? He's either standing up for black people all the time, or he's anti-American. And these have to do with interpretations of meaning, right? Which means that you're taking this, picking out certain propositional content and saying, this is what the guy is saying, I agree or disagree with this statement, right? And if you do that, you're hearing certain things, but you're not actually listening to what happens in the music. And there's like, and when we get to the playlist, when we want to talk about that, like Vince Staples, one of the reasons I like listening to that album, Summertime '06, is he ends with the reflection on like, you are all listening and consuming this at a remove from what we're doing and looking at the glass at us and making certain judgments. Do you actually understand what we're saying, or are you just consuming this and moving on, right? It's Jay-Z in Renegade. Do you listen to music or do you just skim through it? So like it sort of asks that question. So I like that distinction because it moves us from thinking about what are the messages this is giving kids to what are the ways we relate to this music as a form of experience, right? And as a way of expressing experience in a fictional form. So that can run you into some problems with questions of like authenticity, for example. In the case of artists like Nas, there's people who were like touring with Nas. I forget who was saying this. I was watching a Drink Champs a while ago, or a clip from a Drink Champs. And they're like, I was going on tour with Nas, he's blowing up, I'm expecting Hennessy, women, everything is going on, it's going to be popping. And he's like, this man is on the tour bus reading a book the whole time and like writing, like he is a poet. Right?
That makes sense.
It's like if you see Nas anywhere else, you're like, exactly. Right? So like there's a way in which like you have to actually understand that by this having an aesthetic dimension, you have to sort of meet the art on its own terms. I think that's really what I'm trying to get at the distinction, because I think once you engage with it on its own terms, that's when you can see a lot of the actual political or sociological work it can do.
Yeah, that's great. I was wondering, I wanted to push on the same sort of idea, because it's not as though your suggestion for how one has to listen to hip hop, even like like socially, politically conscious commentary that we get with someone like Kendrick, isn't like evacuated, but you think that there is a way of listening to it through only that lens that you call essentializing. You talk a lot in the article about like an essentializing listener. And like there's like something about that way of approaching the aesthetic object that misses something, but it's not as though you suggest like, ignore that there is social and political commentary going on, right? So could you say a little bit more about how like that works?
Yeah, so it's really a matter of if we stay on kind of the philosophy of race, socio-political level of dealing with black art, right? A lot of those essentializing readings come with sort of prejudices or presuppositions of the music and what it's going to do or what it's supposed to do for them, right? Which is why you'll have people who are like, I love hip hop, but fuck mumble rap. Or can I say fuck?
Sorry, you can say anything you want.
Okay, cool.
I say
you
fuck
can
all the
say
time,
anything you want.
Oh, okay.
We vulgar around these parts.
Okay, cool. Or like half of this is just party music and trash. We're not getting anything from this, right? Where that means that you're not seeing that sometimes motherfuckers do just want to go out and party. Like Gin and Juice is a really good song because it's like if I listen to Gin and Juice, I am psychologically sort of not in 92 because I wasn't supposed to be drinking in 92 and I don't think I was. I think I was still in middle school at that point. But we're still listening to Snoop Dogg years later by the time I'm in college, and like this is still an anthem at parties. Right?
Yeah.
So we can then think about the dynamics of what we were doing in those moments, but like that is capturing a piece of life in a particular time, right? So that becomes really important. And I think there's the other philosophical reason behind that has to do something with wanting to make sure that we understand there's a variety of things that these forms of music do. And to kind of jump back to this question of like Black experience earlier, there's a variety of dimensions and aspects of Black experience that aren't just sort of put into one of these particular things, right? And you have to keep that complexity in mind in the music as well as when you're thinking about Black people.
Yeah, I really got a lot out of, there are two things I really got from your article that, again, it's one of those things, it's just like, it's so amazing hearing someone else say something that I think that I was thinking, but you definitely said it much better than I was ever going to. One, it seems as if with the critique of essentialism is also this idea that Black art or hip hop in particular should be a representation of the authentic Black experience. And this can get you into, the kind of web of historical discourse around Black art, politics, and aesthetics that, we now call sort of respectability politics. But I even think like, sort of like with Du Bois and the Talented Tenth is what you should be showing to the world is your best. And thus other people look to the art to educate themselves on what is the Black experience. And so insofar as Snoop Dogg's Gin and Juice, it opens it up to this critique of like, no. Black people, they don't drink gin and juice. Well, yeah, they do. But, but that's not like, help me know how to be a better, not racist person or a better political citizen. So I like this sort of this critique of essentialism because it assumes that there's a singular Black experience to be represented. But the other thing I really liked I wanted to ask you about is when you critique the essentialism, and Lillian was talking about this as well, that, a lot of these hip hop artists, they have personas. Nicki has a persona, Eminem has a persona. I actually never...
She has 5.
All right, Nicki's doing the most. Okay. She's got 5. I don't think I ever would have noticed that Kendrick Lamar also engages in a persona. And so what I wanted to ask you about is also, hip-hop also shows that Black people or this music has the capacity to actually play with identification rather than it's simply being directly autobiographical. In a prior episode, I actually argued that, Fanon's 5th chapter, Lived Experience of the Black, is actually an aesthetic retelling of a narrative. operator. And so this idea that hip hop can be also a space of, a space of engaging with problems without actually directly identifying with them. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this notion of almost being willfully inauthentic. And I put all the scare quotes around that insofar as it doesn't just have to be that person who happens to be rapping saying, this is me. What is that type of freedom in hip hop to be able to play with these personae?
I think it's really kind of fundamental to understanding what a lot of people are doing when they do hip hop, because you can see, I'm hesitating because I want to mention Pac, and I don't like to mention Pac because mentioning Pac can get you in trouble. And you want to also be accurate to
We're
be respectful.
problematic people here, don't you worry.
But cool, all right. But there's but if you listen to, if you listen to Pac, if you listen to Biggie, all these albums, what makes them very important is they're aspects of their experience, but they're being played out in forms where they get to actually express those identities in different ways. In the sense of so Biggie Smalls goes from a dude who's hustling and rapping in Brooklyn to Frank White, from King of New York. So that's already one level of motion where you get to actually play and make yourself larger than you are, right? And that doesn't necessarily then mean that he's embracing a mafioso character, because we also know that there's a tradition in hip hop of a metaphorical connection between the rap industry and the drug industry, right? And that comes up a little bit in Shook Ones when we're listening to it, right? So you're able to actually kind of transport yourself as an artist into those spaces, bringing your experience with you through the art, and kind of also explaining and justifying maybe the character and ethics of what you do, right? And I think that happens on the listener side as well. So when I'm listening to the stuff I listen to, I would call problematic music, is especially in grad school, I was heavily into we rap in a lot of pimp rap. And I was like, why do I love this? And it's because I'm from the South, right? So there's a certain aesthetic to it that I didn't necessarily grow up around those people, but I grew up around that as a cultural marker, right? So my engagement with that object is, one, accents and audio aesthetics that actually will transport me home, and also a certain set of characteristics that are not myself, because I'm actually, that's bullshit. They're not myself, and this is the point of the point. This is the point of what you're saying. All right. Is it's because I was I'm fairly mild-mannered, I'm low-key. I was I've gotten there, right? But I like to dress well and look pretty. I don't get to take as good a care of myself as I used to because we have this kid, but one of the things that was really important for me from college through grad school was I have to have nice clothes, I have to look good going to class, and if I don't look sharp good, I'm still going to have a nice bandana and a shirt that says something aesthetically important for me that day, right? That kind of self-grooming was really important. It's actually the counterpoint to my relationship with women, since I'm more of a simp than a pimp. So there was a way of sort of pushing through and thinking about that. Okay. And there was a way of thinking, I think when you get to the weed rap side of it, it ends up also being used metaphorically, right? So in that Currency verse on Moon and Stars, right in the middle, after he introduces the fact that he's in the Corvette, he moves through sitting in the car with the windows slightly low looking, and he's checking his mirrors because people are watching. And why are people watching? And it's because he's awesome. So there's, on the one hand, you have I am high and paranoid, but I'm also driving around having a good time. And that's the same sort of, I'm also going to have to deal with certain paranoias and insecurities. And a part of why I'm probably self-medicating is to be able to deal with that and function on what I know is a higher level, and not be worried about the fears and doubts that would hold me in place, right? So there's a certain kind of elevation and motivation there. So there's that. There's also another piece of wrestling with the capitalism and all that as well, which is, I think, another aspect.
I mean, I think that the form of the art really lends itself to that kind of externalization of personality and the kind of distance required to kind of accept and challenge different parts of yourself or aspirations that you have, the kind of authentic inauthenticity of it. So part of what makes a good MC is the way that they develop that conversation and being able to master the music. And I say this differently, a rapper is not always an MC. A good lyricist, I know a lot of people, no shade to the Europeans, as I always say. But I've been in a lot of clubs in Europe where you have this Spanish language rap or this Arabic language rap, and it's they are driving a bulldozer over the beat with this really fast lyricism. I'm standing there and I'm this is unpleasant. It's not the good way, you know. I see that you're really talented. You are a rapper. I got it, but you're not an MC. You're not in control of this. part of what makes the genre have that kind of authentic, inauthentic play is that you get to dip in and out of different personalities, kind of like a jazz improvisation. So if you go to like a hip hop club and there's like an up and coming artist who's on stage, and it's not like, especially if it's like in New York where there's like a hip hop scene and like your audience is likely to recognize it, you're gonna go into someone else's flow, you're gonna sample it, and then there's a moment in which you're going to snap and you're going to bounce back and you're going to do your own thing, and everyone recognizes that that's a conversation. So you get to inhabit somebody else's personality, and then you get to flip it in your own direction, and the audience is there with you. They get to like be with those transformations, and so it's not something that like lends itself to undue sincerity. And I think that's what that's part of the that just strikes me as like it's not just that's the social meaning, but I feel like the form of the art lends itself to this, what you're talking about.
No, I think that's on point, right? Because it's a form of play in a lot of ways, right? That's the way you described it at the end. I was like, no. There's a lot of ways in which hip hop is a form of play, right? And that's where you end up using repetitions, you end up borrowing. First thing, since I was just talking about Moon and Stars like that, I'll be obliged if you step outside. That's MJG and 8 Ball, Space Age Pimpin', which is like being used for the sample of the song. So it's like a reference inside of the song, but also him sort of then invoking that persona over the rest of the track, right? And I'm thinking about what you keep bringing me back to, and while like having these conversations with you, is over the specificity of flow and what the use of lyricism does. And I think that's one in like shadowboxing that becomes, you see how it's fundamental to the art. Like, this is a training exercise. And everybody on Wu-Tang has their own style. That's their particular chamber. And like, that was an organizing principle of that group, is we are taking on these personas to be these people. And it's a representation of how we actually perform our art, right? So they develop their characters through this sort of melange of different pieces and sort of make themselves into superheroes, right? But the key to their form, the key to who they are, comes in that form, right? It's lyricism instead of martial arts, but it's the same principle. I think that becomes really interesting. Yeah, I think that's spot on.
Is this what you use the word only a handful of times in the article? But is this sort of what you mean by like signifying? And could you like tie that maybe to go back to something we were talking a little bit about Du Bois before? And we were talking about, you listen to problematic music, but you quote Du Bois and you say that Kendrick Lamar like inhabits and lives with that question that Du Bois asks, right? What is it like to be a problem? And so like this kind of hones in a little bit on the specificity of Black experience in the United States, I guess, in particular.
So when I'm thinking about signifying, I'm normally doing it on kind of the standard semiotic level of sort of what goes on with play on signs. And I like that y'all have pushed me to think about it on this formal level, because I think that's a part of it too, right? There's a different form of embodying those signs within the art form when you kind of gumbo them together. So there's a way, so to tie that into the experience piece, like there's a way in which I'm starting to think about what the aesthetic theory I'm working on does. And I think it has something to do that if I'm looking at concepts in the philosophy of race, of invisibility, invisibility, all these things that have to do with seeing what's not there, or dealing with the fact that you know that something exists, but people are going to tell you it doesn't exist, so you have to roll with that. And the type of critical consciousness that requires, it feels at certain points psychedelic to me, in the sense of it has to do with the fact that you know that there is a reality that's completely constructed. It's real insofar as you have to interact with it, and half of your life is spent understanding the reality of that while not allowing it to define your experience, because if you let it define your experience, you know that you are not supposed to exist. Right? So you can't do that. And most of the ways that you will be signified upon are there to trap you into one of those boxes, right? So I think that's what makes the Kendrick album so kind of psychologically interesting, is you're always jumping in and out of those forms between outside of the album and inside of the album, and then inside of the album wrestling with how these things work, right? That's, I think, and it's clearest for me on To Pimp a Butterfly when it's happening, because that's his "oh shit, I made it and this is going wrong" album, right? Or at least this is not doing what I needed it to do album. Those albums are the ones I think really show you the kind of that's what's going on. And I think what makes that kind of era of rap more interesting in the early 2000s is, and I've been having these generational conversations with Lillian, because the 90s were so obsessed with authenticity. But like, everything at a certain point gets bought out. So like, there's no selling out or not selling out. If you are going to have a job, somebody with money is going to have to pay you, and you are going to have to make art there. and unconsciously or consciously, a lot of these artists actually wrestle with that. So like that's what I get out of Vince Staples. That's what I get out of Kendrick. Is a lot of, I'm going to do this art and make these moves, but I need you to know that I'm aware of my situation, and I'm going to move in and out of that. Right. I'm still trying to figure out the end of Like It Is. He's like, so in this cage you'll find me at. Is he talking about the ghetto, or is he talking about his record contract? Right.
Yeah, who is Shireen, right?
Who's Lucy, the daughter of the devil? Like, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's very. I appreciate you mentioning that there is no, you're not going to get bought out, and so I think sometimes the conversation around sort of hip hop can become really reductive if it is just these people sold out. I like that you're saying that internal to the art form, and it seems as if when you're talking, and now that when I listen to the playlist we all made, I see it there. There's also this almost a constant sort of dialogical structure to hip hop songs. Is also these people, the ones who do make it, the ones who do become like the multimillionaires. Also, what animates it is, how am I here when I used to be there? How am I real when I'm surrounded by falsity? And this opening up of this, what you call in your article, this problem space, this problematic experience that doesn't offer any easy solutions, but it at least lays out this experience of wrestling with this oscillation between authenticity and inauthenticity, or authentic inauthenticity, or inauthentic authenticity. And so I like that there's also something internal to the art form of speaking to oneself, seeing that you're no longer who you thought you were, or no longer who you once were.
No, that's it, right? And I think if we think about the form of the art and its values, right, there's a certain part where like that's what keeping it real actually means. Like it doesn't mean that you're always sort of replicating the thing that you were before, but you're sort of trying to maintain an understanding of self through all of these moments, and not forgetting that you are still connected to that place and those people, right? Which is a different thing. Because there's so many, like the Saba album, it's not all about that, but it really is sort of about kind of figuring out what were the things that grounded me before I got here. Like I live out in LA now, I make all of this money, I'm going back to Chicago, and my neighborhood is almost done. But they just sold my grandmama's house, and that was like the place where we lived and existed, right? When I start to theorize about it, and I might try to do this in a class this fall, right? You can think about this type of reckoning with one's positioning and where you get as a kind of response to this concept of black melancholia, right? Which is, how do you understand how to be yourself if you don't come from a particular place? You're always sort of lost. Where do you find your grounding? And it seems like a lot of what goes on in a lot of these albums that at least call to me are people are trying to ground themselves both in their art, and in grounding themselves in their art, maintain those connections to community in the areas of society that they work in. I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, just real quick, that the Nicki Minaj track, all about her relationship with her family, and how, I've still got them, but, also questioning, like, is what they want from me the money and fame and access that I have, but I still love them. And you're really working through that difficult relationship of belonging in, this really sort of hyper aestheticized manner.
No, that's it. And I don't know. I'm going to pitch this one to Lillian, actually. Do you know, Lilia, more of the context of who and what she's talking about in this track? Because I'm with the rest of the fellows. I'm embarrassed about this, but I slept on a lot of Nicki.
Yeah.
The All Things Go track?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, those are real events, like the death of her cousin, and I think that's a cousin in Trinidad. Like, she has family in Trinidad that I think there was distance there, that like they didn't feel, like she says this on the track, that they didn't feel like they could reach out to her. She was too far removed. But I think it's not family in New York. There's other dynamics between, I think around the time that she released this, her brother Jelani was accused of some pretty horrendous sex crimes, and so she goes out on a limb to kind of talk about the reason that relationship is important to her. She did have an abortion that I think this is one of maybe two tracks where she talks about this, but she kind of talks about like the way that it affects her point of view on having a family. When you think about it, I think she was 38 when she had her first son. So like, I think there's a generational message that she's trying to show, which is that this delayed childbirth that like everyone, and she's older than me, but everyone in this generation is experiencing. And the cost it requires of people to have a successful professional career, and like the psychic toll this is taking on women. This isn't a small thing, you know, like to delay childbirth to your late 30s, you have the chance to get a career, but like the emotional toll, like you're going to be a lot older when your kids are younger. I mean, there's all these things that are happening, and I think she's dealing basically with the costs that her career has placed on her personal life in a significant way, and this kind of existential, like the idea that all things go, just kind of the song is supposed to create a sense of peace about that while you're feeling this existential anxiety through the whole thing, and then she calms you down with the chorus in between every verse. And then the other two ones I suggested were those are both her. I suggested because they're different attitudes that she takes, but they're her coming to terms with men in hip hop from two different positions. Those songs, like those male figures that she's contesting, that's not anybody in particular. That's a metaphor for hip hop as a genre.
Okay, thank you for that breakdown too, because that helps. Because that's the thing that I did want to note about those Nicki tracks, and I think that's interesting about her career too, is at least on the industry side, she's in that generation where they really are getting paid off of this. And she is becoming not just a rap star, but a pop star as well. So that's a level of elevation that a lot of other rappers aren't dealing with at that point yet. Like, there are a few, but like...
She is that person.
She is that person.
She's the figure that turns it that way.
Yeah.
And like, I do think that she's really like generationally important for that reason, both because she is a real MC and she pushed rap into pop. And she's a victim of her own success because now she's like, people don't appreciate lyricism anymore. And that's true, people. Like, no, I know you said that thing about I like all rap but not mumble rap. I don't hate mumble rap at a party, to be clear. I'm with you. But I don't really like, I like pretty much all hip hop at a party. But, you know, I was playing our playlist 2 nights ago. And I was like, I went through and I was like, okay, I'm going to play the first 3 songs on the Rap Caviar playlist on Spotify after I listen to these tracks. I really can't tell you how different it is, and I'm like aware of like the curmudgeonly, like I'm 32, I'm too young to be having these kinds of like shit sucks now. They are like if I was like high and sitting on the couch and kind of gone from the world, I can see it's a vibe. I get it, but when you actually start paying attention to the music, like we're talking about, it is the same flow over and over. And it's over.
Oh, shit.
Over,
That's so accurate.
I know that song.
I know. Yeah.
I listen to that song all the time.
And then, and like the change from like the kinds of like this music that we put in that playlist to like that, like there is a shift in the interpretation of the art. Like the vibe is much more important. And now the older generation, okay, including the ones that helped to bring that to be, are lamenting this fact because the things that you're talking, like, and it has to do with the change in the business model. There's all kinds of explanations for it. It's not that people are not talented anymore. It's that the incentive structure is different. That has changed. So I do wonder, I'm always going to fuck with music that hits those, you know, notes for me. Like, I think the music is cool. It's not going to stop being cool because this is happening. But I do think that I feel like it's TBD whether or not this kind of like the art form, or it's going to go back to being more underground at some point and pop music will morph and then it'll kind of stay, you know, not everyone's going to give it up, but at some point people are going to be like, all right, like let's like rejuvenate here.
No, that feels it. And I'm wondering, like, this is complete speculation, but I keep wondering, because I have a similar experience as you, with a lot of, like, I lived through Migos, it was fun, but, like, we don't all have to keep doing that, right?
Like, it's fine. The moment was there, but, if you love something, let it go.
Yeah. And I can't hate on it, because I have people remind me, and I remind myself of this now, too, like, people, like, this is a job and you were doing this and you can get paid. So if you can get paid doing this, take your money and like get paid. But I think a lot of it is there will still be some outlets for commercial but more complex hip hop. But I feel like a lot of the stuff that we're listening to or want to listen to now is, we call it like underground, or like I'm going to get it on Bandcamp first and end up buying stuff because it's from smaller labels, like if we can go do it, like Billy Woods and these folks on Backwoods, Arm & Hammer, like a lot of these folks they're popular enough to have a following and be able to eat and tour without going completely commercial, and that seems to be where that move is now. The upside is there is a space to be artistic or aesthetically oriented and still get paid without having to go fully into what does the label need me to do this. That's the whole new that's a good chunk of that Danny Brown and JPEG album that came out, like Scaring the Hoes.
I wanted to come back to the original, where we started talking about the problem space, and I really like this idea of thinking of Black aesthetics and also hip hop as like working with these working with these.
Yeah, no,
I got a little one running around too. It's hard to control.
Okay, yeah, this one is getting hungry and fussy.
Oh yeah, I know that. I was going to say, so talking about this problem space, the claim is that it's not the way that you relate aesthetically, like one as an artist, what it relates aesthetically to this problem space is not attempting to solve the problems. It's exploring the tensions. And I don't know, I guess I don't fully understand like what is happening in that problem space that the work of art deals with. I mean, I get there's an element of like play, and I just want to understand it better because I think it's an extremely generative idea. Yeah.
Let me try to ask a bit more to get to your question. So what's the concern about what's happening? What feels unclear in there?
So, maybe put it this way, I guess. I like the idea that these problems the problems that are being expressed aesthetically are so profoundly social and are rooted in aspects of like history, economics, cultural life. They're not gonna find their resolution in hip hop. Their resolution has to be done at a much wider collective level, or has to be pursued at a much wider collective level, and so there is something, and you could say maybe it's therapeutic, or there's some. I guess I want to get more at like what's happening in that problem space, since the problems aren't being solved, right? But they are being worked through. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one where it feels like it's up to. It's a question of what we're doing with the music when we're listening and talking, and there's different conversations to have. So like, a lot of my engagement with those spaces is primarily sort of therapy, psychological issues, since kind of that's where a lot of my work focuses. If you slide towards the more political stuff, I think what you're doing is at least learning and finding different ways to map those spaces and those problems. And I think to understand their connection to, but at least to the psychological effects that you see in society, right? Rather than pathologizing people's behaviors, you sort of understand the context that gives birth to that behavior, right? I sort of run into a problem between the epistemic and the aesthetic there, because
I was going to say that's the epistemic side, right? Yeah,
that's the epistemic side, right? So what I think the aesthetic part is supposed to do is that's the space where you should hopefully figure out ways of moving from, okay, I totally understand this problem, let's go out and think about it and talk about it with some people, to like, what about this motivates me to act, and in which way should I act to respond to this problem, right? It's sort of, it's a challenge to be taken up. And I don't know that it always works, and I think that's just a part of the engagement with art, right? And that's the conversation that Lissa and I were having for a while, and I think why the book changes, if y'all check out our book, by the time she gets to trap, she's like, so trap is the point where rappers realize that no one is listening, so making sense does not matter. Like, why should we make sense if no one gives a shit?
That's actually a weird connection to what I said. Wow, that's like really profound.
Right, and I think about it, and I was like, it's like, yeah, we'll get personal. Like if you, especially like if you work at a university and you do like diversity work, you hit the trap point where you're like, I can explain to these people whatever these things they think want to mean all day, and we are still fucked next week when we go to this meeting. Like, it's just not sinking in.
No comment, but y'all can see my face.
I haven't gone to any meetings here at the University of Amsterdam. I'm only learning and here for my new job to understand what's going on. But like, that's a common experience, and I think that's a common political experience in the United States, where like Black people can be killed and we get billboards, but then like the George Floyd bill is there to fund police, right? They don't seem to get it, and I think that's actually, if Lissa's right, this is an aesthetic issue. It's like you still haven't actually let what's happening sink in. Right, you're still thinking about it on this level of thought and propositions, and not like, these are real people who are suffering, telling you to stop using us as pawns in this shit. Right? Don't thank a guy for dying. Yeah. Like,
it's interesting.
Change the situations that will kill him.
Maybe that helps. Like, so I was talking about the business incentive structure changing. I think that's a big part of it. But one of the reasons that happens kind of very like seamlessly is people start relating to the incentive structure like it doesn't matter, I just want to make money. Like everyone wants to make money. There's no shame in wanting to make some money. It's just like I was listening to interviews with, there's this period of drill music, like drill rap in Chicago. And I was listening to these interviews of these young kids who were doing this, and I think one of them was Lil Durk, who got a little bit more circulation than others, mainstream circulation. And he just said, like, what stood out to me, he's like, this is a job for me. It was like, I don't care, like, this isn't even art for me anymore. This is a job. And so it becomes like a point of entry. Once you realize that people don't care what you say, you just kind of, the form of it has to change after that. So then you get this kind of like producer heavy rap where like producers will be the main ones constructing the sound at any given time, and rappers just kind of like fit into that. They get in and they get out. And I feel like there's a political economy to that, but there's also a saturation point where it's like, well, we've been saying so many things, and for whatever reason, the message, people aren't listening, and then the incentive structure changes once you realize that there's a market for it. I don't know, that actually put a lot of pieces together, how it's changed over time, and why in a sense interpretation or like meaning would stop mattering.
Yeah, and I think that's why that's one of the reasons I keep pushing against meaning. And I'm hearing myself use terms and concepts, and I'm not citing my sources, and it's giving me academic anxiety.
It's a podcast. It's cool.
Okay, cool.
I'm a plagiarist. It's fine.
Okay. Problem space, Stuart Hall. I didn't know it at the time. I knew it now.
That's right. Yeah.
Love Stuart Hall.
And this fight with meaning it's one of those where somebody who let me realize what was bothering me about that was Josh Landy's How to Do Things with Fictions, where he talks about there's certain types of books where, like, so if you're reading for meaning, there's an assumption that people are going to get this meaning from this thing and then understand it and they'll act accordingly, right? But that means that they have to be the right kind of person to receive that meaning and act on it, and that they have to read it in the right way and not take any of these other divergent readings, right? So it can't be that. But there's a way of reading literature that says within the structure of this book, there's something that the author is trying to do, and that can train a certain critical facility aesthetically, right? So like in Socratic Dialogues, for example, he poses this problem of why are there shitty arguments in a dialogue where if we're supposed to be following this for meaning? And it's like, because pretty much a good thing to do with the Socratic Dialogue is figure out how to discern good arguments from bad arguments, right? This is formal training. Right?
Yeah.
And then you can see how this leads into aporia. There's a good one on reading the Gospel of Paul where it has to do with, like, why does Jesus speak in parables? And people are normally like, because parables make things easy to understand. And they're like, no, if you read the Bible, no one ever understands the parables, and he's only usually talking to the disciples.
That's not what happens.
It's not what happens.
What happens.
I can't believe I'm about to say that, but it's like a Nietzschean aphorism. He's like, you gotta chew the cud.
No, exactly, right? And the other piece is when he uses them and they're successful, it's because other people know how to speak in their code. So it's moving from a common way of understanding to a spiritual form of understanding, right? And I think that's like, if there's a spiritual element to hip-hop, that's a part of it is sort of figuring out how to keep that part of the music alive, I think, through that self-engagement with the form. Right, keeping that question alive for yourself and not getting caught up with, for lack of a better word right now, like the nihilism of it, where it could go, where it's like, no, I'm really just here to make money and make art. And it's like, well, if you do that, at least make good art. And maybe then at least still think about like the structure. And what I mean by that is like, think about, so if you're going to reproduce this and you don't want to wrestle with those problems, what are the things you can do and still make money that don't seem to reinforce the things that you don't want to reinforce, right? There's an ethical decision there that I think you can make. But that's, I think, an artistic decision and a listening decision as well, an audience decision. Like, what do you do when you also consume as well? And, like, how do you actually limit that consumption and maybe stop letting the algorithm pick the same shit for you over and over again?
To build directly off of that and to connect to, the things that, Owen and Lillian were saying, I'm wondering with the problem space, it is about moving from simply contemplating the art piece. The way that I think about it is, I've actually grown to really not like the sort of what in my head I call the Aesop fablication of art, where it's just like, and here's the moral, we are the world, or black people, they're human too. There's something flattening and also deadening in that, where you approach an aesthetic object as, so tell me what it is I'm supposed to do now. But as you were talking about the parables, the Socratic dialogue, we're coming back to what might be a particularly aesthetic practice is how to listen, how to develop a sense of what is the hook here, how can I respond to it, how can I experience this problem and make sense of it. So a weird kind of example that I often think of is I am, once again, this is an episode of me saying embarrassing things about myself. I once tried freestyling because I thought, what could be easier than freestyling? It's just talking. Y'all, freestyling is one of the hardest shit that I have ever encountered. As you start talking, you're not only having to respond to this other guy who's calling you out by your name, saying things about your mama, saying things about your whack fashion. You also end up listening to yourself and be like, wait a second, how do I build off of that random thing I just said? And what actually is a punchy line? So that might be kind of a joke, but I think there's something there of even the freestyle battle is a problem space of how do I keep it going? How do I respond to what this other person said? And it turns out doing something like that spontaneously, it takes a lot of the skill of being able to listen and respond. And so, maybe there's this nice distinction between the contemplation, where it isn't really about responding, but simply just subsuming into what you already know, and the sort of aesthetic opening out into the problem space of learning, how do I receive this? How do I respond to this? How do I, allow myself to understand it?
No, that's it, man. And there's two good points I think that come out of that too. Is like, one, respecting how hard this is, because that's one of the impressive parts about like the part where it flips in DNA and Kendrick just starts rapid firing over the scratch until they won't let it go. It's like, so this goes really hard, but what also happens is like he doesn't shut up the entire time. You might be able to hear a breath, but like you have to listen, and it's just like he's trained himself to do this, right? So like there's a kind of somatic for training that he's had to do to make that happen. And then the example you use of freestyling and that listening back and forth too, right? This is another way of jumping back to when we were talking about the persona, right? You have to have a certain character who's able to move back and forth and make those connections. You have to be steady on your feet, right? And like, so jumping out to like different things to do with hip hop, like that's one of the things I end up doing with, sometimes when I'm doing lectures and stuff, I like to overplan and it doesn't work. So it's like, I'm going to freestyle this. And there's like, there was an old Eminem Stretch Armstrong freestyle where they just like, they give him a word and they let him go and they just keep spitting words at him and he has to keep going. And I'm like, if I can do some shit like that, I cannot be stopped, right? And it's a matter of, at a certain point, you understand that you have the concepts, you trust them, and then you just give prompts and you can just go. And as long as you understand flow and rhythm, you don't lose time, like, and it becomes a kind of meditative, transformative activity, right? There is some kind of self-fashioning going on. That's really cool.
And you have to like really pay attention to culture, like to be able to Mad Lib, like things like that. You have to pay attention to what is going on. Like, not only do you have to kind of get the form and the different, the cadence and the tone, and like learn how to like syncopate with whatever is there. You have to like be looking around constantly in awareness for references, because like some of that shit they say is random as fuck. Like you're just like, where did this come from? And it's kind of like, but you have to be constantly kind of making personal notes to yourself of little punchlines, and then like find the right way to fit them in. And that's a level of like aesthetic observation that is, I just like find it constantly incredible. Like you must be just have like cultivated like this awareness muscle where you are like constantly looking for an opportunity to bring stuff in.
And that's like, we were watching, what the hell were we watching? We were watching like Friday Night Lights or something the other night, and they were showing the quarterback learning the plays, and they do a good job of showing like all of the, it's just like, so what's this play? And they're like, so this receiver does this receiver this count. Like, right. So there's 80 other variations of that play. You have to know those. And like, I think doing hip hop is the same thing. There's like a encyclopedic library of cultural references, current events. And if you're freestyling, you're checking the person out in front of you to read things, right? So it is actually an aesthetic perspective. And I think like when you switch to the listener side to like go back to that problem space question, like that's something that you're sort of, at least I'm asking myself and audiences to cultivate, is like, so now hear what they're saying, and then what are they saying, what is that reference, and where does it go? Because I think that creates a consciousness of being able to trace the structure of these problems and have that in your mind, right? and to be able to have that conversation of the actual extent of what we're talking about rather than sort of focus on these little events and these little sort of references, right? There's an entire vocabulary that people don't understand because they just don't know a whole set of people, right? And this sort of moves you into that space and maybe teaches you how to listen better than you did before.
One last question that I wanted to raise is one of the things you had us read was this book or the introduction to this book by Lissa, and of course, like, you know, it's not your writing. You may or may not co-sign everything that's in there, but one of the things that she talks about is like refusing a reading of the art that gets produced in this way as redemptive, and instead thinking about it in terms of reconstruction. And I was wondering if you could, like, I don't know, unpack that a little bit. There is like a redemptive mode of listening that might miss something that's important about this kind of art in favor of a kind of reconstructive mode.
Yeah, that's Taylor's vocabulary, I think.
That might be Taylor's vocabulary. You know what? You're right. That's Taylor's vocabulary. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay though, because I remember because I looked at it and was like, I forgot about this distinction. I'm glad I reviewed this before I came on here. Because I think why that's really important is sort of it's when he's recasting Reconstruction in the article, he's doing Reconstruction versus the redemptive project, right? And I think the redemptive readings are those readings that we're talking about that fold it into what we already know and then keep it pushing, right? Versus sort of actually trying to reconstruct what's happening and make those assemblages go down. And I think that's one of the big differences, right? Is I don't know, there's a way of like, you can listen to the same songs sometimes for joy and entertainment, but then also go back and figure out what is this trying to do. And that's a different aesthetic challenge, and that does something different to your habits, right? Like we were talking about an ethics of listening, and I got into like deeply listening repetitively, all these things. And it's like, how many people do we know have the time and take the time to just sit down and not do anything else but listen to music? Like, is that a habit anymore? And I know like hip hop heads do it because the people are listening to stuff nonstop, and this is where their vocabulary comes from, and this is where they develop that understanding, right? You learn to study the art and you learn to study the world. And I think a part of what the problem space thing is meant to do is sort of to push other folks to do that. Like, find the reality through the art, not in authenticity, but in where these signs are pointing you and what they're meant to do and how we react. Even reading your own reactions to them to see, like, why do I find this so gut-wrenching? Or why do I find this so funny, even though it's so terrible? Like, where does that come from?
This is the last thing I'll say. I do think that the kind of ethics of listening is something that you start to acquire later. Like, I don't know how early you started listening to things seriously, but like, I feel like when I was younger, I was like a sponge. You know, it was all vibes, and I didn't quite understand. And I do feel like in the past few years, I've started to think more about why it is I liked things I liked. And it's almost like something that you can only see in retrospect. And I realized that the coming to my own appreciation of what works in hip hop, you know, because that's one of like probably the two genres I've listened to my entire adult life. It's like when I started realizing that I know what works and what doesn't, I started asking myself why. Why does this work and this not work? Is it just me? And then I realized that what was going on there was taste that I didn't have before. Like, that's what it is. And so like when you start developing the ethics of listening or listening with care, I'm not somebody who, you know, I've said before in this podcast, I'm not somebody who thinks in aesthetic terms a lot, but it's almost like the wisdom of life experience forced it on me, where I started to think, I do know what's good and bad. And then I'm going to cultivate that, because I'm going to think, why does this rapper seem gimmicky to me or repetitive, but this other person doesn't? And when I was 19, that would have been all big same. You know, that like it would have not, it would have been a total wash. It was more about vibes and, you know, the punchlines and so on. And then when you start to like assess it, I don't know, I think that's the Kantian moment where you're like, I am making a judgment and I think this other people should agree with me about this. I'm going to postulate it as kind of universal.
Damn, Kant made it into
Appeals
the chat.
to the sensus communis.
Yeah.
Subjective universality.
The sensus communis, you know what I mean? Yeah. That's what it is.
I completely agree with that, by the way.
That was dope.
Anyone want to? I'm going to close this out unless you guys want to take it away from Kant. I didn't actually mean to leave us. End it with Kant.
I was scared. I was about to mention Hume, and I was like, this might be not going in the right direction that we want to go in.
No, that's the direction it has to. Let's just keep going back through modern philosophy and just watch Gil power up.
Let's just have a quick 15-minute digression on of the essay of national character real fast.
To be fair, I kind of made my peace with Kant when I just decided that deontology is a form of making and enforcing judgments rather than something fundamental about them. That seemed to make more sense to me. It's a way that the judgment's held and enforced rather than anything else, and you want certain criterion behind it to do that, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what you said, Lillian, was really cool is it kind of remixes and says something important about Hume's concept of taste that hip-hop kind of defeats, which is he seems to say that taste is something that's cultivated. But like your search from going from kind of this initiation to a kind of cultivated taste also starts with an initial point of there's a particular taste that gets you into the art form, and that's what's refined over time, right? And you get that from this wide sort of smorgasbord of media that you can absorb, and then out of that you develop a perspective. So it's not that there are people who have taste and then tasteless folks, right? But it's something that develops. And I think if we roll that back into the conversation we've been having about Black aesthetics, right, then that's a social practice.
Yes.
Right? It's something that you do once you have listened to and engaged and related yourself to enough artists and also to enough listeners to have conversations to then sort of move through that space, right? And I think that's a much different model than sort of we have those with what was it? It's the I'm blanking now because it's getting late, but like the standard of taste and the sense of passion, I think it was, right?
Something like that.
Something like that.
All right, that does it for us today. We once again like to thank Dr. Michael Thomas for joining us. Michael, would you like to tell our audience about where they can find you online and about anything you've got coming up?
Oh man, nothing coming up recently, but if you want to find me online, most of my papers are up on academia.edu. I have a Twitter and an Instagram, but I'm not really active on social media anymore, so it's mostly just social media. Unless people can get me back online.
Stay away.
No, don't go back. Than me. Don't get corrupted by that aesthetic atmosphere.
It's all going downhill anyways.
All right, new episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Satish Reddy, Darcy, Marcus Froderberg, Eric Eldridge, Trogdor the Burninator, Robert Jansen, Alex Benishek, Cam H, Hehe Wo, Benjamin Agradnik, Peter Dorward, Lana Barake, Miri Davidson, Jim, Micah Davis, Badi Politic, Ulrich Plass, Sarah Bellum, Yasa Veselinovic, Ryan Pierce. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos, and access to our Discord server. In addition, you can support us by buying some What's Left of Philosophy merch. It's all very cool, which you can also find through our website. Follow us on Twitter at LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Michael, so much.
Thank you.